Good evening and welcome to On the Record. I'm your host Adam Jasser. Poland's proposal to set up a Baltic Sea policing force took a more concrete shape this week at a NATO summit in Finland. A NATO force called Baltic Sentry will use ships and electronic surveillance from several NATO members around the Baltic to protect undersea infrastructure from Russian-linked sabotage.
The Baltic Sea has been dubbed a NATO lake after Sweden and Finland joined the alliance last year in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia is the only non-allied state on the Baltic's shores, accessing this vital sea route through two ports, St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad. In recent months, Moscow has escalated what many Western politicians describe as an intensifying hybrid war against NATO, using acts of sabotage across Europe and the Baltic region. Its so-called shadow fleet, unmarked vessels operating under foreign flags, has been tied to covert activities targeting critical underwater infrastructure. In 2023, the Baltic Connector gas pipeline between Finland and Estonia was severely damaged. By the end of 2024, ships associated with Russia and China had disrupted undersea cables connecting Sweden, Finland, Estonia, and Germany. NATO had been slow to adapt. Hybrid attacks, designed to fall below the threshold of traditional conflict, challenged the alliance's ability to respond decisively.
We are seeing now what would have been utterly unacceptable 5 years ago. But we've kind of gotten used to a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and that's very dangerous.
Poland, recognizing the growing threat, has taken the lead in calling for stronger NATO action in the region. Finland demonstrated a potential way to handle that when its law enforcement seized a Shadow Fleet ship suspected of destroying cables linking the country to Estonia.
Poland and other countries on the Baltic Sea needed to be protected with constant and effective security measures.
That vision came closer to implementation this week at a Baltic NATO summit in Helsinki. Allies agreed to form the Baltic Sentry, a joint maritime force to safeguard communication lines and critical underwater infrastructure. It will deploy state-of-the-art surveillance technologies, submarines, and drones to provide rapid response to potential threats.
Safeguarding our infrastructure is of utmost importance. Not only is this crucial for energy supply, whether from power cables or pipelines, but more than 95% of internet traffic is secured via undersea cables. And 1.3 million kilometers of cables guarantee an estimated $10 trillion worth of financial transactions every day.
Russia's strategy in the Baltic is clear: destabilize Europe, sow confusion, and test NATO's resolve. Yet, the alliance's members in the region now appear more prepared to act decisively. This, in turn, makes the Baltic Sea a front line in a broader confrontation between Russian imperial ambitions and Europe.
To discuss this, I'm joined today by Władysław Bartoszewski, Polish Deputy Foreign Minister. Minister, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Minister, the Baltic Sea was once called NATO's internal lake, but has it really now become the frontier of a proxy war with Russia?
I wouldn't say it's a proxy war, it's a war. With a war which is carried out with different means. People think that the war should be between armies. Conventionally, that's the situation, and to some extent that was the war in Ukraine. But the war in Ukraine now, it's not so much the Ukrainian armed forces which are the target for the Russian missiles, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, but particularly the critical infrastructure in energy. Because it's much easier to attack the infrastructure, which is not guarded the same way as the armed forces or the military bases. And the result is devastating, because if basically Russia managed to destroy all power stations in Ukraine that are not nuclear. They are so far shied away from nuclear because the consequences could be rather devastating and difficult to control. And if you destroy the power stations, there's no electricity, therefore there's no heat, and there's no water because pumps do not work. and therefore the people start moving and abandoning their towns and their houses, and you create destabilization and a very good situation for your armed forces.
So in a sense, what's happening in the Baltic could be seen as an extension of that sort of targeting of energy infrastructure?
Well, what the Secretary General of NATO just said in the introduction is it's not only power cables, not only electricity, which would have not only the pipelines, but the cables which carry the internet, which would paralyze the financial sector in the world and devastate the lives of millions of people. And it's much easier to do. I mean, what do we have? We see a ship dropping off an anchor and pulling it across the bottom.
Yes, there was a report in Newsweek, I think 2 weeks ago, that the Chinese have developed a special anchor to do that.
Well, it's much cheaper, much easier, and it's much more deniable if you're not watching it. Of course, the Finns, being I would say one of the very few NATO armies which are fully prepared for a war with Russia. Mm-hmm. They've been preparing themselves as a society. The civil defense there is phenomenal, and the cohesion of Finnish society is fantastic. They won't ever tell you that. They are very silent, but they are very good. And as they showed, they
talk less but do more.
They don't talk at all, but they do work. And what happened with the Eagle S, they didn't just say, oh, maybe that ship did something to our cables underneath. They just boarded the ship, tagged it to moored it in Finland, and discovered some irregularities.
Would Poland do the same in a similar situation?
I hope so. We have to develop a bigger navy. And we are in the process of doing.
But Poland committed 4 ships, 4 navy vessels to this new Baltic Sentry Force.
Yes, and we are working very closely. Our forces complement each other. The Swedes have quite a good navy, and in fact very well developed. And the Finns and Norwegians and others, and we contribute to that, but we also have other armed forces which are actually developing extremely well. So our links with, I mean, thankfully, I would like to thank Mr. Putin, because thanks to his brutal aggression of Ukraine, we now have 2 phenomenal members of NATO, meaning Finland and Sweden, and with great capacity and capabilities, and we are way safer now than we were before.
Right, but we just heard the Assistant Secretary of NATO saying in our report that NATO was a little slow to respond, and these incidents were not just in the Baltic Sea, but also we heard the Polish Prime Minister talk about attempts to blow up planes, sabotage actions across Europe, and he was arguing this is a boiling frog situation. So my question to you is this Baltic Sentry initiative that Poland initiated and is now taking shape, is this enough, or should this be just the first step?
It's one of the steps which are being taken. We have faced sabotage attacks all around Europe, not only in Poland, but in Germany, in France, in Spain. And we now realize that this is actually a war. We are at the state of war with Russia, carried out by different means. And I don't like to call it a hybrid war, because it's some kind of
euphemism.
Euphemism. I mean, it sounds like you have a vehicle which is part electric, part fuel driven. It's not that. It's a simple war using unconventional means. And we were slow to react because we didn't. There's always the issue, if you are attacked in a so-called kinetic war, you've got a procedures and a plan and developed over decades. And this we didn't know how to react. But
do we know now?
Yes, we have learned an awful lot. For instance, we were at first surprised by the sabotage attacks. It's usually arson or monitoring trains or attacks on people, physical attacks on people, and not done by the professional intelligence officers of Russia, but by third parties which are paid a couple of €1,000 to do something, and they don't know anything. They cannot therefore spill the beans with the exception of one Ukrainian, which we caught in Wrocław, who said I was recruited by GRU. Therefore, we expelled the consulate from Poznań in retaliation. So that's a cheap and safe way to do it. Now, I know, I mean, I'm not going to any details, but I do know that counterintelligence services have started to develop a way to monitor and prevent these types of events. And we do it across our NATO allies. We exchange information and discuss what techniques they use and what we can do about it. And this sea thing is very new, and we started quite quickly. And I think it will be very robust response. And I really wouldn't be so sure if I was on the Russian ship that the Swedes and the Finns would not act very decisively to do what has to be done, and we will do everything possible to assist them.
When you talk about such measures, are you talking about, I don't know, escorting suspect ships by Navy ships of NATO countries, or are you talking about boarding them, or what kind of measures are we?
The Finns showed that, but there was a previous ship which was kind of in international waters.
That's right.
And nothing much happened to it because it was in international waters. The Finns said it's a ship which did damage to our cable. Most likely, we are boarding it. In other words, you have to be bold. It's now a war. It's not now. We cannot do anything because it's not our coastal waters. It's international waters, and the law of the sea allows them to do whatever. But the law of the sea doesn't mean that they can damage your property.
Right. So, in other words, you said this is a major first step. So, what other steps do you envisage in the near future when it comes to the safety of the Baltic Sea and also countering these acts of sabotage?
I think it's now a beginning of a very close cooperation between the Nordic states, the Baltic states, and Poland on trying to control the sea, through which very many ships of shadow fleet, the so-called shadow fleet, carrying oil from Russia to various buyers, and we are trying to identify the ships and stop them, because this is basically an illegal trade, and it's also ecologically very unfriendly because the ships are old, they're not maintained, and if we have a major oil spill in the Baltic, which is a very
But in
shallow...
practical terms, how do you stop them? Do you stop them at sea and bring them into port, or?
I think it would depend on the circumstances. If you have legitimate concerns that they actually did some sabotage and real damage, like the Finns, they just boarded it and get it to Finland.
Right.
So it depends what will happen. But and we are trying as NATO allies to identify and stop the shadow fleet altogether. We have a number of ships identified, but there's probably more than 1,000 of them floating around.
But not going through the Baltic Sea.
Not all of them go the Baltic Sea, no, but all of them, they go somewhere else, and they change they repump the oil from that ship to another, and then it appears to be legitimate oil from somewhere else. I mean, it's a...
So this is deterrence, possibly, but is there a risk of escalation on the Russian side now that NATO took these measures?
Well, I mean, we keep hearing about we cannot do something because it's an escalation and Russians will attack. I mean, and I haven't seen any
My question was really about, is NATO prepared for a possible escalation? So are there any measures prepared that, let's say, there is some kind of escalation, NATO will react quickly?
Yes, NATO is getting quite a lot aware now that, I mean, what Prime Minister was mentioning, that there was a potential attack on planes. So the planes will come down. I mean, one already came down because Azeri plane, which was damaged by a missile, by a Russian missile.
And there was this plane in Lithuania. I think investigation is still ongoing. So it's
still
not
ongoing, but Azeri plane was damaged by a Russian missile. And then, of course, crashed. So, and in this particular case, President Putin apologized to President Aliyev. who demanded this apology because and the whole thing is being investigated, but it's not investigated in Russia. It's not being investigated using any Russian personnel. It's investigated in Brazil. Because Embraer's the plane is produced of course, in Brazil. The maker is in Sao Paulo. So it's an international investigation.
I understand. So maybe to finish on this subject of the Baltic Sea security, you know, Poland receives a significant part of its gas through the Baltic pipe, going all the way from Norway, and the Polish military said they are controlling the Polish section of the pipeline and protecting it. Is Poland confident that our allies in the Baltic Sea do the same with the rest of the pipeline? And how safe is this infrastructure?
Well, I think now that we are fully aware that there was a report which was denied about some ship loitering around the Baltic pipe.
Well, we heard it from a source, a very good, impeccable source.
I heard it from an impeccable source from the chief of our armed forces that it is not true.
But he was talking about the Polish section of
the Polish section, yes. And but Norwegians are very much interested in that because it's also their pipeline, and the Swedes are very interested in this. And Swedes have developed phenomenal submarines which operate in very shallow waters. They specialized in the Baltic.
So are they deployed now to monitor
because they are
the
deployed.
pipelines? They are.
They
Okay.
are
Great. Well, you know, let me switch the subject a little bit. It's still going to be a sort of maritime subject because the safety of sea lanes and also connections, undersea cables and all of that, it came up also in the context of Greenland, where President-elect Trump said, you know, return to the topic of securing Greenland for the United States. It caused some reaction and some commotion. At first, people thought, oh, maybe he's joking again, but then it became clear that he's quite serious about it. What's Poland's view on the future of Greenland?
I don't think we, as a government, have any view on the future of Greenland because that's a matter for Denmark, of which Greenland is an autonomous part. But I look at it historically. The war of the Atlantic, which the Germans were winning
during the Second World War,
during the beginning of the Second World War, turned after 1942 because the Allies had control of the passage between Greenland and Europe. And in the Cold War, the British Navy employed 50 warships in that the stretch of water. And then, of course, the peace came and nobody bothered to do that. And the Americans correctly point out that somebody has to have naval presence there because the only way the Russians can go into the Atlantic, realistically, is through that piece of water. And we need to have better control.
But should it be done under a NATO umbrella, or is it really so important to actually move Greenland to become part of the United States or a territory controlled by the United States?
I don't think it's necessary to move Greenland to the United States, but it's up to the inhabitants of Greenland and the citizens of Denmark who have to vote on that as well. But it often happens that President Trump says something which sounds quite outrageous, and then after a while you start thinking there is some logic in it. To give you an example, President Trump said, I'm not going to defend any NATO country that does not spend 2% on defense of GDP.
I think he used an even worse phrase. He said, I'll let Putin do what he wants with them.
President Trump has a colorful language. And he said, if they don't spend 2% of GDP on defense, as was agreed by all these countries in 2014 at a NATO summit. And 3 years ago, only 6 countries spent 2% on defense in NATO. Now, out of 32 members, it's over 20 spent 2%, and of course we spent close to 5% on defense. So now, that is a result of President Trump's statements. All of a sudden, the Germans...
To play the devil's advocate, I'm not entirely sure, but I think most countries started to spend more on defense only after Russia invaded Ukraine.
To look at it more historically, President Obama said you have to spend more than 2% on defense. President
And
Clinton
nobody listened
said, and nobody listens to that. It's only when President Trump uses the language, which is rather forceful, that people start thinking, oh, well. And I had discussions a year ago in Berlin about the need to spend 3% on defense by Germany, which they were spending about 1.3%
at that time.
And they said, oh, no. I said, you have to start spending 3-4% on defense, otherwise you are going to spend 8% on defense. And I was told by a very senior politician, we never spent 8% on defense. You must be crazy. And I said, if you have Russian forces on the Oder River, you will. And he said to me, oh, yes, then we will. I said, by then it'll be too late.
Right.
So now so President Trump identified the problem that we must have control of this naval passage between Greenland and Europe. In other words, have enough ships available there. Otherwise, we may end up with tremendous problems. So now we have to start thinking, yes, actually, this makes sense. People say, Mr. Rutte, who is now the General Secretary of NATO, said a couple of days ago, said you have to start thinking of spending the 5% on defense, because if not, you are going to be forced to spend 10. And look at it historically. How much the very peace-loving Chancellor of Social Democratic Chancellor of Germany, Willy Brandt, spent on defense? 3.6% of West German GDP. How many troops did he have in West Germany? 900,000. How many tanks did he have? Battle tanks, in other words, tanks which can be used at the front, 5,000. And how much did the US spend on defense during the Cold War? On average, 8% per year of very large GDP, American GDP. And how much did the US spend on defense during 1943 and 1944, when they had a total war with Germany and Japan? 45%.
Right.
This is you have to keep it in mind. If you don't want to do it now, the worst will come. So right. I would say let's listen to President Trump, because he may not have the right solutions, but he identified the problem.
Speaking of listening to President Trump, there is a lot of talk in Europe about the fact that Poland is emerging as a sort of new leader of Europe, given the overall vacuum, leadership vacuum, if you will. I mean, this is what many commentators in the West are saying. But they also mention Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, and they very often mention it in the context of her good relationship with Donald Trump and the new incoming US administration. So is Poland working with Italy on how to provide this leadership for Europe?
It's slightly stretching the credulity that say that we are the leader of Europe, but we are
wishful thinking.
But maybe. We are one of the leaders of Europe. We have emerged as one of the leaders of Europe because, for instance, the initiative which we had, Poland had, to enlarge the Weimar Triangle and to have meetings with the 5+1 in a 5+1 format. That including not only Germany and France, but also Italy, Spain, and as the sixth member, this +1, the UK, with which we have a phenomenally close relationship, especially in security and defense. Phenomenally close. It started in this format started meeting every month because it actually makes sense. We in terms of defense spending, and we started to lead Europe. Not in percentage terms. In percentage terms, we are number one. But in terms of percentage, it depends on your GDP, so that's irrelevant. But in terms of actual money, we are now the 5th largest spenders in NATO. NATO, right, which includes USA, includes Turkey. So we are We
have to slowly finish. So I just wanted to ask you a last question. So when is Prime Minister Tusk going to meet Italian Prime Minister Meloni for a bilateral meeting?
I don't have any knowledge, but Prime Minister Tusk meets the leaders of the EU members regularly in Brussels because at the meeting of prime ministers. So he maintains contacts with, and he is the most experienced prime minister of any EU countries as far as Europe is concerned, because not only is his third term as a prime minister, but he also ran the European Union for 5 years, as a council for 5 years. So he knows everything there is to know about EU.
Minister Bartoszewski, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching. This was On the Record. See you next week.